everybody, I'm Pastor AJ Houseman, and welcome to 10-Foot Pole, a podcast dig deeper into aspects of the Bible that get glossed over or totally ignored in most preaching. The Bible has a lot of parts that are racy, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright horrifying. Let's talk about it. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 11. This is fantastic.
Oh my God, 311. I am back in high school. Okay.
Why, what's 311?
Oh my God. Okay. I've just aged myself because I am 10 years your senior.
Exactly, because we share a birthday.
To the day I am 10 years your senior. 311 is kind of like this. 311 was a band that I really liked when I was in high school. All right.
Oh, okay. I'll look them up later.
Yeah. So season 3, episode 11.
Perfect.
Good numbers.
Our guest today is the Pastor Tuhina Rasche, who is, as we have established, we share a birthday, so we're birthday buddies. So I always remember to wish exactly 2 people happy birthday every year, and you are one of them for that reason. Not my spouse, not my mom, Pastor Tuhina. Okay.
Wow.
Pastor Tuhina is a mission developer in the North Carolina Synod, doing fun, cool digital ministry stuff like other cool podcasts, and is also a magazine editor. You're just living, you're the cool pastor life.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to get to the next day.
Like, someone just said cool. What? No, you also have a puppy, so that like puts you in that perspective of like, were we up all night with the puppy? What were we doing with our lives?
Yeah, I'm like, I look at you and your spouse with like total admiration, because how do people do this with a human? Like,
it's rough.
Because I'm kind of like, I've got like, I don't know, like I have like my calendar set, and like Carl and I try to like line up calendars and like who's on duty, who's got the purple.
You know, I have to be honest with you though, as I think that like the puppy stage might have been harder than the kid. My kid has yet to poop all over my office, but my dog sure did.
Oh my gosh.
Well, thanks, Tuhina, for joining us today as we dive into our very first matriarch in our Advent study, Un-Ladylike.
Oh, okay. So when I saw the Un-Ladylike, I am like, I am here for this.
Yeah.
Like, let us do this. And
you can thank Deacon Julie Stecker for that win of a brainchild there.
Oh my gosh.
Her creativity was just on top of it. Mm-hmm.
Look, I mean, like thinking about like creativity, it's like Deacon Julie is like
up, 100%.
I know, I'm like,
but anyway, so we dive into we mentioned briefly last season. I think it's like season 2, episode 4. If you go back, we did an episode before Christmas with Pastor Sarah Garrett Cray, who's an assistant to the bishop in Washington, D.C. And we talked about this beginning of Matthew here, where there's this genealogy. There's genealogies all over the Bible because we need to keep reiterating the story of these people. We talked about this on the podcast many times, to understand that, especially as we, read through the Old Testament scriptures and into the time of Jesus, that this is specifically about a certain lineage of people. The whole time, it's this people of Israel. It's not about the Edomites. It's not about the Hittites. It's not about any of these other people who also would have somewhat been in their same category of like faith and clans and cousins. No, it's very specifically about this line of people.
What I love about the genealogy, though, especially when we come to Matthew's gospel, is that like there's like this sneaking in of subversiveness. And I think that because I didn't come to Christianity, I mean, I'm late to the game. And so for me, like genealogies are fascinating because it's just kind of like, this is our communion of saints. Thinking about like how All Saints Sunday is like at the cusp of the end of the church year. And that thinking about like, who are the people that brought us to this point? And when I look at the genealogies, it's not just names. Like, these are flesh and blood people who ensured that we could be here today. And I think it's like, and yeah, sometimes the names, especially in the Hebrew Bible, they are a lot to get through because it is like verses and verses and verses of names. And at that same time, it's not just names.
Yeah. And especially so as we talk about the one in Matthew here, and that's the reason we're doing this podcast study, is there are 4 women that are called out in this genealogy of Jesus. And this is not normal, like not normal even in a little bit. And especially the women who are called out, they're called out for a reason. And it's sort of to understand that there's an importance to them being a part of this lineage. First of all, the reason it's there, it's also in the Gospel of Luke, is it's really important for them, especially at the time as they're tracing this lineage and giving Jesus his divinity, especially because he's a Galilean, not a Judean. That's a big deal. To kind of trace him through this line, that it's important to name that he is a part of this very specific line that is, quote, the people of God, right? That it's important to place him in there. And so as they do this, typically you would always name the male in the family, right? Always. Like even
Hello,
if
patriarchy.
yes, patriarchy, right. But even if it goes through the women, like it would still, like, you would name the man even if it is technically her wife, right? So like this goes and says Joseph, right? Well,
Like,
Joseph's
wait a
not.
minute.
Yeah. That
Hold up.
yeah. So like it's important there that like Mary is also named, but like to put those in there. And so there are these 4 women who are called out. And so today we're going to talk about the first of these women who are called out. And so I'm going to read just really briefly this Matthew chapter 1. We're just going to slowly read it as we make our way through Advent and get down through these fun women. But verses 1 to 3, Matthew chapter 1, an account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. And Perez is the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Aram. So
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. There's a
Judah
name in there.
is the
Judah.
father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar.
Tamar.
Now, there are actually 2 biblical Tamars. The other biblical Tamar is the child of King David, whom, to my understanding, is named after his great 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 grandmother, this Tamar.
That is my understanding. But we're talking about the Genesis Tamar.
The Genesis Tamar, yes. The other Tamar also has a little bit of a kind of a sad, scandalous sex story as well, but that's a podcast for a different day that we could dive into Tamar the second. But we have our first Tamar the first. And I think I love Tamar and the fact that like she is not someone to mess with.
Look, like, I think part of the reason why I really resonate with Tamar is that there are systems and structures in place to keep people in their place.
Yeah.
And Tamar has been literally used and abused by such structures to keep people in their place. And so if Tamar is going to experience any sense of freedom, any sense of liberation, that Tamar is going to need to know how to bend those systems and structures in order to lead her full life.
Can you give us a little, so Tamar's story, it's one chapter, takes place in Genesis 38. So it's in a weird spot. Like all of a sudden, you know, it's part of this big chunk that the whole story is about Joseph. And so we get this thing where like Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery. And then we take a pause. We spend one chapter on Tamar, and then we go back to Joseph's story, and we don't hear about her ever again.
Until the genealogy.
Until the genealogies, and that's the only other place that her name crops up.
And it's like, wait a minute, why are we taking a breather from Joseph? Because if Joseph's supposed to be like the patriarch,
right,
who's responsible for saving the history and the people, then why are we taking this pause?
This one pause.
Let's talk about the pause. Let's talk about a holy pause, because I think oftentimes we don't pause enough. We just kind of push and plow right through. and talking about why this pause is in here. And so it's like, because, Joseph is like the favored son, right? Like,
you got the pretty coat, all those things.
I want a pretty coat. And that the brothers are just kind of like, we are so sick of our little brother, because that's the other thing about systems and structures, that it's always supposed to be about the eldest.
Yeah.
It is always supposed to be about the firstborn. And what really intrigues me about what happens to Joseph, what happens to Tamar, is that it's not always about the first. It's oftentimes about the person at the margins. It's often about the last. It's often about the least of these. And it's often about the sojourner, the widow, and the orphan. And in this case, we are dealing with the widow.
Yeah. Do you want to share, could you give us like an overview of, because I'm not going to read the whole chapter. So an overview of Tamar's story.
All right. So Judah, so we have to start with Judah though.
Everyone dive in, grab your pants, sit down.
Grab your pants?
I don't know. This is a big story. This is a hefty, heavy story.
It is a hefty, heavy story. So part of this hefty, heavy story is that once Joseph is sold into enslavement, we cut to Judah, and Judah is like, I'm out. Like, I kind of don't know what to do right now, so I'm out. I'm going to a different place. I'm going to try and figure some stuff out. And in the midst of going to this different place and trying to figure stuff out, meets a woman named Shua, who, to my understanding, is a Canaanite woman. Hold up.
Yeah.
Hold up. Hold up. Isn't it in scripture, like, this is also keeping in mind that this is also technically thousands of years removed from Judah, but like not thousands, hundreds. I don't know. My brain is still kind of like working through the story. But the realization of like, isn't intermarriage dangerous?
Yeah, God, Genesis 24, God's like, don't do that. Stay away from the Canaanite women.
Right. However,
actually tells them not to do that.
Right. But also we have to keep in mind, it's like the intermarriage does keep happening, like because Moses marries Zipporah, Joseph marries an Egyptian. And so it's this realization of like, what's happening here? Like, what is this interplay between peoples? And I think that this is actually like, and we're still trying to figure out interplay between peoples, because we still don't have stuff figured out. If we're going to look around the world today, that folks who claim land, whose land is it? And so we're getting into like these really awkward discussions, and actually really uncomfortable discussions of like coming into people's land and coming into people's lives and coming into people's cultures, and who technically, and I'm doing air quotes because I realize that this is a podcast, and
I
so
do it all
like,
the time. It's fine.
Yeah. And so it's like the air quotes of like, whose is it?
Yeah.
Whose is it? And like, does it really actually belong to anybody? And so Judah goes into a different land, marries Shua, and has 3 sons with Shua. And so for the eldest son, needs to find a wife for the eldest son. And so yeah, so the eldest son named and marries off to Tamar. Tamar, which I discovered, means date palm. Did you know that? I didn't know that.
I read that somewhere too in my research.
Okay, so in my research, also read date palm. So I'm actually really glad that this is being affirmed. And so it's like, wait a minute, date palm, aren't we kind of like in an arid desert land? And so thinking about, date palms, because dates are normally grown in like desert, arid areas. This is where they grow. This is where they bloom. And so it's like, and have you had a date?
I don't think so.
My God. Okay, so dates are like, I love dates. Dates are kind of like toffee, sticky, sweet, creamy. And so having this kind of like sweetness in this dry, arid, desolate place is really fitting to have this name Tamar. Yeah. And so Tamar is married off to Judah and Shua's eldest son. But then dies. It's like dies, and what's the other really tricky thing is that dies, but there's no heir.
Yeah.
There's no offspring.
Well, so it also says that God kills him.
Yeah. Yeah, because was wicked in the ways in the sight of the Lord. And that's the last we ever hear of
And that's it. There's one sentence. There's he was married to Tamar. He was wicked in the sight of the Lord, so God killed him, and that was the end of him. That's all we know. We don't know like why. We don't know what happened. One of the Jewish scholars that I was reading speculated that it was because he had committed the same sin as Onan.
Well, let's get to Onan.
So then, after her husband has died,
has died, she is then. So the other thing that just really gets to me is that, like, within systems of patriarchy, that women who are married into these systems become a form of property.
Mm-hmm.
And so Tamar is then considered to be like Onan, like, but there's no marriage. That's the other thing that we don't
now actually... the property of the house of Judah.
Right. So we don't actually read that she has been
officially wed to the second son.
Correct. So but there's supposed to be some kind of like Onan is supposed to fulfill the duty to ensure that has heirs.
Has
heirs.
As the oldest son, right? To continue that lineage.
To continue the eldest son's lineage. And so Onan is essentially just a stud factory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
At this point. And then Onan,
he decides he's not all about that. We don't know if he hated his brother or what, but he absolutely was not going to make his brother sons. Right. So that, and whether it was like, are they going to inherit his brother's share, right? So he doesn't want his brother to, quote, have sons, or what his deal is.
And so here again, we get into this, like, this in corvatus in se. So here's the Lutheran in me coming out of like, well, what about me? And so when I think, like, whenever we get to a point in scripture when people are like, well, what about me? Things are destined to not go well. Case in point, Onan.
Yeah.
Onan has the in corvatus in se, the what about me isms of like, well, what about my inheritance? Well, what about my children? What about my life? Well, that life is cut short by God, because Onan spills the seed on the ground. No baby, no offspring.
Yeah.
And thinking about, like, what is one of the worst things that you can
intentional
do?
It's not spill. Let's be clear about spill. So Onan does what we modern day people would call pulling out.
Withdrawal.
That's a nicer way to put it. Yeah. But that, like, on purpose, right? Like, intentionally.
Purposely, and so intentionally withdraws, because the realization of, if he goes through with having offspring with Tamar, they're actually not his offspring.
Correct.
Even though, if we're going to look at it genetically they would be his offspring, but legally they would be Er's offspring.
Yeah.
And that they would still fulfill the line of and not fulfill the line of Onan.
Right.
And so this puts Tamar in a really weird situation, because
let's talk about, so then, this Onan also, God kills Onan for this too. And
because it's like, if you don't fulfill family lineage,
well, there's two sins here in their day and age. The two sins, like, obviously, like, he's not bearing his brother's children like he should, like that thing. But the second one is actually just wasting his seed. All the big rules in, like, Leviticus and stuff like that come up, it's all about wasting seed. So they believed that man's semen contained all of the necessary life force, that was literally divine substance that were coming out of men. Also, why we get this patriarchal system that men have all of the power, because men have God dwelling inside them. Women, they thought, were literally just the incubators, that they didn't actually contribute genetically to it, right? Which doesn't really make sense. Like, what if your kid, like, looked exactly like your wife? Like, wouldn't that be like, or like all of these mixed race babies we're having here? You'd think that, like, but anyways, that's what they believed. That's what they believed. And so this is the big sin. And this is why these sins are all listed out. All the things you shouldn't do in Leviticus. That's what it's about. This is what they believed. That's what he's not supposed to do. And that's exactly what he does.
Right. So
Which, for a fun fact, so people that are big on masturbation being a sin, this is a sin of onanism, is the name given to the sin of masturbation and birth control. Because that's thought to be his sin here, right? Like he's essentially practicing birth control. And this quote, wasting, his wasting of the seed, right? I would think that there are other sins that he did. To me, that's not the sin that I would identify in his actions here. I would identify this sin of taking advantage of someone, this sin of what's the word that I'm trying to find? Like what he does to her is deceitful.
It's cruel.
Yeah, that's another.
And it's also objectifying her. It's literally just using her body.
Yeah. But when folks that like to, talk about birth control as a sin, this is a place that they point to in scripture to talk about that as well.
Oh my gosh, because
birth control and masturbation go together. So
let's just use one verse to justify an entire system and structure.
That happens all the time. Where are you at?
Oh my God, I've been reading the Bible wrong, haven't I?
This whole time, obviously, didn't you know it's a huge rule book on how and what and why we should do things? And you can obviously point to places in scripture that tell you exactly what and how you're doing everything in your life wrong.
I think I really need to reread the Bible then. Again.
We can definitely come back to it. But okay. Let's finish talking about Tamar's
We may have to come back to it, but it's like, I do want to come back to Tamar's story. And so Tamar is in this really awkward position because she's Er's wife, now widow. She's the property of the house of Judah. She's supposed to be producing somebody's offspring, but right now we're in a holding pattern because Er's dead. Onan withdrew and did it voluntarily and committed really big, like, bad things. And so now Onan's gone because Onan was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and now Onan's dead. And so because Tamar is the property of the house of Judah, she's now supposed to marry the third and last son. Not marry, I'm sorry, produce offspring. Because this is like, I'm realizing like the language that I have and like the culture and context that I have, I am like, I'm committing like also a big sin of like, I can't keep imprinting what I know from our present times into times past. And so Tamar is then supposed to be set aside for the third son.
But returning her to her father's house is not normal.
No, this is not normal at all. And so this realization of like, okay, so the third son is not old enough to have hair on his face. And so it's like, all right, well, Judah's like, Tamar, I need you to dress up as a widow because that's who you are. But I need you to go back to your dad's place. Until the third son is ready to take you on. Oh, sorry, it just gives me the heebie-jeebies. Like, not necessarily even marry, but just to like
perform the duties.
Just heebie-jeebies. Okay.
You go. No, you go. I'm sorry.
But thinking about this, so like Tamar is then spending not a short time at her father's house.
Yeah. Which again would just like not be normal. Like there would be they would never send her back to her father's house. So in my mind, I'm like, she should have known something was up then, because that wouldn't have been the proper thing to do. She would have still been property of the house of Judah.
Right. And so she should have stayed within the house of Judah.
Yeah.
But then this realization, if she stays in the house of Judah, she will see Sheila growing up to become a man. And so then by the time that he is ready to become like a man, air quotes again, whatever that means, that in the time that he is ready to become a man, then Sheila can take on the responsibilities that were supposed to be Ur's and that were supposed to be Onan's.
Mm-hmm.
But in this actual physical removal of Tamar to her father's residence, she's not able to witness and advocate for herself that, like, he's ready.
Because he doesn't want that, right? It's like, that's the whole point, is like Judah had no intention of actually ever following through.
No.
And that's the only reason he would have sent her back to her father's house, because there'd be no other reason for her to be there.
Not really. And so this puts Tamar in, like, yet again, this really, like, there is literally no place in this society for her. No place. Because she's nobody's wife. She's nobody's mother. She's property, but she's property that, like, the property, like, the person responsible for this property doesn't really even want to deal with her.
Mm-hmm.
And so what is she supposed to do? It's not like she can get divorced. It's not like she can just, like, start her life anew. She's stuck in this patriarchal system where the system was not built for her. The system was not built for her needs. The system was not built for her liberation. The system was not built for her to have life abundant. And so what happens in order to figure out, like, well, what am I going to need to do in order to have the life that I want to have and to be fulfilled and to be not necessarily a wife, but to fulfill my duty that is expected of me as a woman in this time, in this place. So, we get to Shua's death. Judah's wife, Shua, dies. And so, period of mourning, whatever. And so, at this point, Judah goes out with one of his friends, and Tamar hears about it. And so Tamar
they go sheep shearing.
Yeah, they go.
Yeah, it's some kind of euphemism, because, like, that's also how he met Shua, right? Like, he went into his buddies and they went out sheep shearing, right? So this, whatever the sheep shearing euphemism is, they're going out sheep shearing together.
Oh, Lordy Lou. Okay, so sheep shearing in air quotes, whatever this means. So Judah was comforted, and he went with the sheep shearers to Timnah. He and his friend Hira were, like, hanging out and shearing sheep, doing what you do. And so Tamar hears about the sheep shearing.
Mm-hmm.
Tamar hears about, like, okay, so Shua's died, and Sheila apparently is becoming a man, and nobody's informed me. And so I'm going to bend the rules.
Well, I think people are informing her. So, like, if you think about the role that, like, the village people who everyone else,
but the person who's supposed to be informing her is not. That's primarily what I mean, because it's like, there's always the church parking lot post council meeting where you get, like, the air quotes real information, but you don't actually hear from the person you need to actually hear from.
Correct. Yes, so, but, like, she is aware of what's happening, and whether or not she thought it was weird when she was first sent to her father's house or not, she's not buying it anymore. She has figured out, hey, this guy's playing with me, and he's leaving me out here to dry, right?
Not even out here to dry. Like, he's leaving me out here in the system of limbo where, like, nobody can advocate for me. I can't even advocate for me. He won't advocate for me. And so I'm stuck in the system where I can't even exist as a human being. And so the person who's supposed to be, like, advocating for her and, like, in charge of her life and, like, her dealings and her comings and her goings, we'll get to the comings and goings because, that's coming up, is just, it's not happening for her. And so being at her father's house is also in this weird state of limbo because she's not even supposed to be there.
Yeah.
This is like the never ending movie of Clerks. I'm not even supposed to be here today. And that's Tamar's life at this point. So she's hearing from other folks, but not the folks that are actually like responsible for her well-being, of like, hey, sheep shearing's happening. Sheila's older, you know, and people might be telling her, it's like, shh, you know, we think something's amiss. Yeah. Something's wrong here. And we want to let you know, because the actual people who are supposed to let you know, the systems and structures and institutions sound familiar. They don't want you to know that things are wrong.
So she takes matters into her own hands.
Well, yeah, of course she does. This is why you don't want to mess with Tamar. So Tamar decides, like, I'm going to take off my widow garments. I'm going to take off what physically and visually identifies me as a widow. So that's the other thing of like, people don't want to mess with widows because they're already handled property. Oh God, I just feel gross saying that.
I know.
It just gives me the heebie-jeebies. And so she takes off the garments that identify her as a widow and that like literally set her apart from actually getting to participate in life and society. And so she wraps herself in a veil. And she sits at the entrance to Enaim, and it's on the way to Timnah. And so realizing that, like, okay, so Sheila's grown up, I'm still in my widowhood, and nothing is happening for me. And so here's what's going to happen. I hear that Shua's died, and that Judah is on his way to shear sheep and like hang out with Hira. And so I'm just going to wait for him in my veil, and let's see what happens.
Yeah. The idea with this, like the shearing sheep, right? Like his wife's died. It's time to go out and look for a new one. So they're out like a night on the town, right? What would enhance your night on the town if you're some gentleman looking to shear some sheep?
Let's talk about sowing some wild oats.
Yeah.
So, in the midst of sowing some wild oats, that Judah at this crossroads sees a woman in a veil. A suggestive woman in a veil, if I may. And decides that as he's coming closer to her, like, oh, she's not just some damsel, like she's actually designated for sex work. So Judah is like, hey, lady. I mean, like, oh my gosh, this just feels
soliciting what he thinks is a prostitute.
Right. And so I think, like, yeah, it's so funny because like I'm realizing that I myself am even struggling to like talk about sex, and this realization of like, we are full embodied people who do full embodied things. And our scripture is also filled with people doing full embodied things. And so realizing that like patriarchy, I know, has something to do in like limiting how I talk about this and like my uncomfortable feelings. And also pure tyranny has like this weird aspect of coming into play into the series of being unladylike, because what is happening, whatever society deems as ladylike, what is happening here is not women being put in their place. This is women acting outside the system. And so Judah
and like so what she's doing right here, she doesn't actually get like at the end of the story, she's not condemned for her actions. But what's interesting is the perception of her actions as they have been talked about, because of just that. Like, this is a deceptive, not proper lady thing to do.
This is really hella unladylike.
Yeah.
And also because like, it's just really peculiar because it's like, oh, look, here, let me lay down with you. But Tamar's like, hold up. Before this business transaction takes place, this actually needs to be a business transaction. And so in the midst of this business transaction, a transaction needs to take place before I offer my services. What I find about this business transaction is that it's Judah's staff, And it's Judah's like signet, his cord and his signet.
So that's not what's agreed upon. Those are as like collateral, right? So like they're in a business transaction. So he
Right.
says, oh, okay, we'll give you a kid. So a goat,
But
right?
it's like,
We'll give you
right,
a
but
goat. Is that worth your the next,
but the promise of the goat. So it's like
yes.
he
So
could
here's my promise of the goat. And she was like, no, 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 no. That's not how this works, man. You have to give me some sort of collateral. How do I know you're going to follow through with it? And so what he chooses to give her as
is
collateral
essentially
is like,
his social security card and credit card, his
yeah.
social security number and credit card.
And his passport, his ID, like something like that. Like, man, this is
What
that?
happened? I think okay. So I don't know if you're
Sorry,
gonna
side note, we're on Zoom and all of a sudden Tuhina just had balloons going up over her screen like we were celebrating this moment.
like this was like
Like in
yay
happy
business
birthday text on an
transaction.
iPhone and you get that, like that's what just happened on your Zoom screen.
I think this is like the celebrating of talking about the full embodiment of people and scripture, and that yes, it's like Judah's like, I'll give you a goat for this business transaction. And Tamar's like, I need more than the verbal promise of a goat. I need collateral for the goat. So
Yeah.
when you bring me the goat, I will give you your items back. But the items that Judah chooses to give are his social security number and his credit card.
Isn't that like to he okay. Nowhere does it say it, but like he's gotta be like drunk or something, right? Like to be out of his right mind to give a stranger, a woman whom he's paying for his services, like those most important things, right? Like that is and it is not like he would never part with those. That would not be normal at all. That this is so outlandish that he would give her those objects as collateral.
But the other thing is, it's like, what else would he have?
I,
His cloak? Like the only other thing I could think of would be his cloak. But the thing is, it's like, how is Tamar going to get reassurance that Judah's not just going to get it on with her and then leave, never give her the goat that he's promised her, that doesn't also at the same time not realizing that this is his daughter-in-law?
yeah, that's some veil, right? Yeah.
I mean, like the other thing is, it's like I also realize like when you like really want things, like it can alter who you are in that place and moment in time where you can't even recognize things. Like this has happened to me too. Like I wear my when in my first call, like wearing my clerics and wearing my alb, and that like this is how people view me because I'm their pastor and I'm wearing an alb and I'm wearing clerics. But like I run into them at Target and they're like, oh my god, pastor, I didn't recognize you with clothes on.
Yeah.
It's like I don't want to know how you see me on Sundays.
Yeah. Like that's not phrasing. Um yeah, so the object that he chooses to give her, and like I mean like this is a well-hatched plan of hers, I think, that she comes through with this way.
So I think
Right?
it's like
So she gets
she's she's smart as all get out because but if you think about it, she has had years to think about this.
bro,
She has had years
waiting for her opportunity.
to figure out like what are the ways, shapes, and forms that like opportunity will present itself.
Yeah.
And in those ways, shapes, and forms, how do I bend the rules so that the opportunity can get me out of this non-existence? Because I know that when I have like time to think, it's like, oh, I mean, like I'm also a type A. And so it's like, I think about like, I'm also a 6 on the Enneagram. So it's like, I will plan to my heart's content and I will have like actually like, A prime, B prime, C. Like I will have like a list, a series of plans and then a series of sub plans. And then even also a materials list because it's just who I am.
Probably had a lot of free time hanging out in her dad's house.
Right. And so in the midst of hanging out at her dad's house, realizing like how am I gonna start existing again because I don't exist right now. And so this is her opportunity to exist. And this is her opportunity to actually like to incarnate her future in a carnal way. so so the pledge is that, okay, so for this goat, you're going to give me your signet, your cord, and your staff. You're going to give me the pieces that identify you as Judah, contractually and legally, and like in travel.
Mm-hmm.
So these primary identifiers he gives to her
As this
and
collateral. Yeah.
as collateral for the goat. And then they have sex.
Yep. Does the thing.
Yep. The business transaction happens.
Yes, the business transaction happens. And
And
then
so in the midst of this business transaction happening, Tamar, they get up, she puts off her veil, she puts on her garments of widowhood again, and then Judah's like, all right, oh, well, crap, this is embarrassing. Like, I just gave away like my key identifiers.
well, so he sent his friend, and he's like, can you go give this goat to that I owe this to that prostitute from the other day and get my stuff back. He sends his friend to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so he goes and like they search the town and like can't find her. Like,
yeah, so what happened?
People are like,
what
no, there's
whore?
no prostitute around here. That's not a thing. We don't
Mm-hmm.
have those here.
Yeah.
So he can't find her, and so he's like, ooh, so he doesn't have so he never gets his stuff back, and is like,
I kind of love it's like, I guess she's gonna have my stuff forever. I guess let her take it. Like, I sent the goat, but nobody found her. So whoopsie.
Wow.
Big freaking whoops.
Then
time passes, 3 months later. 3 months later, that Judah hears
is
yet
starting
again
to show
through the grapevine. Judah hears, Tamar, yo, your daughter-in-law,
your widow shouldn't be lying with anybody.
However, she is showing.
Mm-hmm.
And so, of course, Judah's like, well, this isn't good. We probably just need to end her life at this point.
Well, it's like now his honor's on the line, and he's like, oh, well, we're gonna burn her because how dare she do this and dishonor me, dishonor you, your cow, your whole family.
Your cow?
It's from Mulan.
Oh, okay. I just suddenly felt my Hinduism come back.
Little Eddie Murphy. Dishonor on you, dishonor on your family, dishonor on your cow. Okay.
Right. And so Judah's like, bring her here. We got to burn her.
Yeah.
We not burn her, like roast her like you would at a comedic roast, but we literally have to burn her. Yeah. So Tamar comes to her father-in-law's, and so but she's also kind of like, do you want to know who the baby daddy is?
Guess what?
I actually have proof of who the baby daddy is. And so she's like, yeah, whoever is the owner of these said items,
like right in public square.
Yep, is the father. And so she brings forth the signet, the cord, and the staff.
And he just accepts it. Like, he's just like, oh, damn, she got me.
Yeah. Well, and she's more righteous than I am.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I was supposed to give her my son, and I didn't. Now I'm the father of her children. Like, this is like, where's Maury Povich when you need him?
Right. Because that's it. Like, it just gets so out of hand so quickly. But the whole thing is like, she is promised this place in this. So it's about the lineage, right? Again, we talk about like how important these genealogies are, and that like she has this promised place in this lineage and is being left out of it. And she's not having it.
No, because she's literally in a place of non-existence. And that, even in today's society, is one of the most dangerous and vulnerable places you can be. In a place and space of non-existence, in a place and space of non-citizenship, in a place and space of not having a family. And so to be that vulnerable in such a patriarchal society is living a non-life. And so how do you get back to actually living a life? And into getting back to living the life is like Tamar, I think Tamar actually like had to take control of her own history, of her own
Yeah,
destiny.
she
And
does.
this realization of Tamar taking control of her own destiny and her own history, this is how we end up with Tamar in Matthew's genealogy. Because Tamar does not become just like another nameless woman in our scripture, because we are also flooded with nameless women who have been used and abused and literally cut apart.
Yeah.
And so to have a named woman who is able to like actually use the systems and structures that are in place to ensure her own place in history and her own place in the family that was meant for her, that was like assigned for her through marriage. Like this is a big flippin' deal.
Yeah, it's
This is a
huge.
big flippin' deal. But the other thing that
She could have
really
just
just
grew an old lady who died in her own father's house. He would probably would have died first, and she would have just ended up like destitute on the side of the road. Like she was not. She was like, absolutely not. That is not my place. That's not my life, and that's not what's happening to me.
and I think like this is another reason why why the Hebrew Bible prophets were so adamant about the protection of a sojourner, of an orphan, and of a widow, because Tamar being a widow, she would have nothing, absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
She would have no property, she would have no offspring, she would have no lineage, she would have no future. And at that
No one to
point,
take care of
she would
her,
have
right?
no life.
Yeah.
And so this realization of Tamar being somebody who essentially had to trick her way into history, who had to fool her oppressor. Because the other thing is Tamar's in an oppressive system.
Yeah.
And so in the realization is like, how do you get out of an oppressive system? And that's through being subversive. And so Tamar is having to be subversive to ensure her future. But the other thing that just really kills me though about like editing and like making things appropriate and like trying to make things ladylike,
Yeah.
like there's editing that takes place in this weird interlude of Genesis 38 of like trying to make Tamar more ladylike. And so when Judah encounters her, so like looking at some of the research is like the Hebrew word for like what is a common prostitute and what is like
Yeah.
like a temple prostitute or a cultish prostitute.
They're
So
different.
this realization of like one is of like a common lower stature, whereas one is like where having sexual intercourse is actually viewed as a holy act if you're going to be like a temple prostitute. And so this realization that Tamar also journeys from being a common prostitute when Judah encounters her to when Judah's friend has to go look for her, all of a sudden she's elevated to temple prostitute.
Yeah. Imagine him telling his friends that. Be like, well, she wasn't one of those. She was actually one of these kind of prostitutes. Yeah. The Hebrew word does change there. Because they are different words. So just something for the audience to recognize. Yeah.
Right. And to further clean up and make the story like quote ladylike is that Judah never had relations with her ever again.
Yeah.
Like I had her that once and then never again, because
the duty has been fulfilled.
That would be awkward. Because things aren't already awkward.
But you know what? Like technically at this point in time, she should still then like be able to like get remarried and become the wife of the third
Sheila,
son, right?
Of the third son.
That's what I thought.
Because
which we don't hear anything about that either. So just
but
this lady's done her thing.
Right. And she's been unladylike because she had to be unladylike to save her life.
Yeah. Well, so here's the deal with like, oh God, I hate the phrase like ladylike, like you're not being very ladylike. Do you know what? If being ladylike means sitting there and taking it, if ladylike means just being told what to do, if being ladylike means that people just get to decide what happens in your life and that you have to exist in this certain way, then yeah, no, thank you.
Whoever gets to determine the terminology of what ladylike is,
Mm-hmm.
the person who holds the power over that word and what that means for behavioral attitudes in society, like that's a lot of power right there.
Well, it's a
And so,
patriarchal word.
well, of
Ladylike
course it
is
is.
it only exists because of this system, right? That word in itself only exists because of this system that like women are supposed to be a certain way because of this defined system.
But what I also love about the genealogies, and particularly the genealogy in Matthew, is that we have subversive women and we have unladylike women and we have women who are looking out for generational survival.
Yeah.
And the realization of like the reliance of like, so this is just me going on a wild tangent right now, so don't mind me, but the realization of having subversive women in Jesus's genealogy also opens the door for the importance of women in ministry in the Gospels. Because were it not
Yeah.
for the women, we would never have heard of the resurrection. Were it not for the women in the book of Acts and like at the last concluding chapter of the book of Romans, that Paul is greeting a series of women who ensured the future of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And so this realization of women who are not bound in this system of patriarchy of men are this and women are this. And so this realization of moving past these binary gender roles into something that is more expansive so that like we can actually be unladylike.
Mm-hmm.
So then that way we can be who God is calling us to be beyond gender.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, yeah, so that's where I'm at.
I don't
But
even think
yeah.
that's a crazy tangent at all. I think that's right on point.
Well, and I think like that's why it's so important because we also have inherited such gendered scriptures because who edited?
Yeah.
Who edited these works? And so the realization of like we have nameless unnamed women. We have women who have contributed to the future of the church who get like a verse. And so I think this interlude of Tamar in the midst of Joseph's story, thanks be to God, this was not, I mean, like this story
Wasn't edited out? That someone
well,
could have decided this wasn't an important thing to add
and
the
being that
full story?
it was edited to be like more, in quotes, palatable.
Yeah.
This realization of like, even with our Revised Common Lectionary, when I first heard about Tamar and Judah, like I had not been Christian that very long. And I was like, I could not get enough of the Bible because I was like, holy shnikes. Like I've only known about like the like I know about Jesus and I know about like the good happy things, but I don't realize that the story of God and God's people is filled with very real human lived experiences,
Yeah.
which are also bloody, which are also broken, which are also trying to figure out who we are in the midst of being God's people. Like we still don't have stuff figured out yet. If we did, like we wouldn't be in the messes that we're in today. We wouldn't still be reading Tamar and being like, damn, she knew what was up and that she knew that she had to be subversive and that she's this model of subversiveness that Jesus took on, that Jesus embodied. Because I mean, if we want to talk about like peak subversiveness and who we're called to be as Christians, we're not called to be nice. We're called to be followers of Jesus. That does not necessarily equate to nice, and that sure as hell does not equate to ladylike.
Does not. And Jesus was not very nice, actually. Especially,
No.
I mean, we've been in the Gospel of Matthew a lot lately, and Jesus is all sorts of angry and telling horrible murdery parables
Look,
and stuff and
weeping and
yelling at
gnashing of
people
teeth
and
shows up
yeah.
so many times, but like that's also, but yet I think like that's the other reason why I have like this love-hate relationship with Matthew's gospel, is because we are still in a time of weeping and gnashing of teeth. And we will be until God's world is reconciled to God. And so until that happens, we're going to have to be real about talking about weeping and gnashing of teeth. And we're going to have to be real in talking about what it means to be unladylike.
Yeah. So I want to add just a couple more things to like the story of Tamar and kind of like where it sits in this bigger story. So as we talk about like the importance of like their lineage, right, and their genealogy, and why it was so important that there were oldest sons of this, there were sons of this oldest son, is because Judah is now ultimately, well, I guess technically it hasn't been said yet in Genesis, but Judah becomes the heir apparent in their family. He has 3 older brothers who have disqualified themselves from being Jacob's heirs. 2 of them, in my personal opinion, probably shouldn't have been. Their sister was raped, and so they defend her and murder a bunch of people, and that apparently disqualifies them. And then the third one is disqualified because he slept with his dad's concubine. So now Judah is the most favored oldest child, and is now this again. So if we follow the course of this lineage and this history, that this is the thing. So all of this is explaining when and how and why I think that this story is included is because it's necessary to explain how this line continues and goes through now that Judah is the oldest. And so even these, so when he gets Tamar pregnant, they're not technically his kids. They are still technically the kids of his oldest son. So that's actually why then these 2 twins are higher in their patriarchal hierarchy than his 3rd son is still. And so they're a little further. So she does have twins, and so there's a huge argument still about which one is technically the older son.
Because the subversiveness continues on in her birthing of these twins. And so who is the first son? Is the first son the child who stuck his hand out and had the red thread tied around it? Or is the first child the one who exited her womb fully first?
So that, okay, so the concluding of the story. So as she's giving birth to these twins, one of them sticks their hand out, and they tie a thread around a red thread around the hand to indicate that this child that this was the firstborn, quote, because and then the hand gets pulled back in, and the other baby is actually birthed first. So that's a huge argument then, that I don't think has ever fully been resolved. Although the one that was fully born first is the one that is in the line to which we continue to follow. So,
well, and I think like this is where we get into like certainty and concreteness are actually ways to dismantle our faith, because of like, well, if this is absolutely certain, then there's no room for any creativity, there's no room for any imagination, and there's no room for any other possibility.
Yeah.
And I think that the interplay of like subversiveness and the interplay of like who actually is first and who actually is second and who actually is last, these definitions throughout the course of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament get flipped on its head repeatedly.
So a little bit further in understanding and placing these things, when you talk about like concreteness, about like some folks like to read the Bible and be like, well, this is 100% exactly how it happened as it is in the order, and then they were all written in this order, blah 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 blah. And there's this story actually, you can really nice place to challenge this. So one of the things that people who like to read the Bible really literally will talk about is they'll say, well, this whole thing of like giving her to the second son, blah blah blah, is the levirate marriage, right? That's a law that shows up in Deuteronomy. Well, technically, if you want to be literal, that this would predate that law. But, and I say a big but, because as scholars have dated, this Genesis was actually written later than Deuteronomy. And so these are these are people from a retrospective place writing about the origins of their people, right? So all of these stories in Genesis are meant to explain that, the origins of their people and how they got to be where they are. Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus. So they're explaining how is it that they got to be where they are. So they've been written later to explain the sort of their origin story, if that makes sense. So if you read it with the text within that light of like, hey, this wasn't written down in the moment as a documentary of these people, but rather people a few generations later are writing these oral stories that have been told to them to explain when and how their people got to be where they were and what the role of God was in the midst of all that. So from that perspective, you now look back and you're like, oh, well, that makes sense if we're applying the levirate marriage, because that would have been a normal thing to them in the day and age that they were writing it, that's obviously what was happening in this situation.
Well, and part of the realization is that looking at Genesis and realizing that part of Genesis may have been written in exile when the Israelites were not on their land, like whoever's land it is, because that's a whole other series at this point. But this realization of like, what does it mean to reclaim your narrative when you are separated from the land that you call your home? And the realization that oftentimes you have to be the subversive one to start reclaiming your narrative so that overarching narratives and other powerful narratives are not like the stories that are yours, that are stories that are told about you but are not actually your story.
It's claiming the story of who you are as a people, right? That because they're separated from their quote homeland, that they have to write and they have to explain who they are separately from a place. And that, I think, I could go down a tangent on this one, but I think that's a challenge for everyone to say, who are you when you remove the place? And that's the story that they're writing.
I think because who are you is such a complicated question that is not just like, it is an incarnational response, but it is also a response that is tied to physical spaces, and not just one physical space, I think, even though oftentimes stories have limited us to one physical space. And realizing that our scripture started off with a wandering people. And that what is one of the biggest yearnings for people who wander? Oftentimes it's to find home. And so what does it mean to find identity, to find place, to find community, and to find life ultimately, within systems and powers that oftentimes try to take life from you?
Yeah. And those are the very things in which Tamar is doing too in her story.
Yeah, because she is of a land and she is of a people, but that land and that people transfer, and the realization of being transferred to a particular land and particular people, she has to figure out, who am I and what is home and what is my identity in the midst of all of this?
Yeah, in essentially exile. That she is essentially exiled.
Yeah,
has to
because
figure out.
she
Yeah,
is.
I think Tamar actually is a good parallel and representation of the story of the Israelite people and their identity and having to subversively make their own place in their own way in the world. I think that's a very easy, that's a very good parallel.
Yeah.
But this, that this very unladylike woman claims her place, stands in the midst of them and says, absolutely not. This is who I am, and this is where I am, and this is where I'm going to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if that's unladylike, great.
Awesome sauce. Let's do it.
That's the page I want to be on. Yeah. Thank you, Pastor Tuhina, for joining us today on this first of our matriarch series. I'm just so excited with the women that are going to talk to us and the women we're going to talk about. For your studies, remember that there is downloadable material on our website that's going to have some, actually have the scripture lesson in there with some questions related to that, questions about our podcast episode, and questions about women in modern day society and how they relate to the situation that we're talking here with our matriarch Tamar. And some prayer for you and your groups to come together and dive into this uncomfortable but great, amazing Bible story that we need to talk about. So good luck on your discussions. Good luck. That's not what I want to say. I hope that you have deep, meaningful, fruitful conversations about this. That's 100% what I want to say. And remember, you can always learn more at 10footpolepodcast.com and find us on Facebook and Instagram at 10footpole podcast and wherever you listen to podcasts. That information for the materials on our website is in the links in the podcast episodes. If you're on Spotify, just hit that little thing that says show more and you should be able to find it there. And as always, remember that the 10-Foot-Pole podcast is a ministry of the Delaware Maryland Synod. To learn more, go to dmdsynod.org. Take care, everyone, and talk to you next week.